The 1st Minnesota's charge at Gettysburg was one of the most selfless acts of courage in military history. Outnumbered 4-1, they knew they wouldn't come back, but they charged anyway. This is their story. Sergeant James Wright had long since given up on keeping his boots intact. The left one had a hole in the sole big enough to let in every rock and thorn Pennsylvania had to offer. The right one was only slightly better, but after marching all day under a brutal July sun, he doubted either would last another mile. He sighed, shifting the weight of his musket as he trudged forward with the 262 men of the 1st Minnesota Volunteer Infantry. The road into Gettysburg stretched ahead, dry and cracked, the dust kicked up by thousands of weary boots hanging in the air. Cannon fire rumbled in the distance, a reminder that this march would end the same way all the others had, in battle. To Wright's right, Private Marshal Sherman adjusted his cartridge box, muttering something under his breath. Wright glanced over. "What?" Sherman shot him a tired look. "I said, if this ends up like Fredericksburg, I'm quitting the Army." Wright snorted. "We got a year left in our enlistment." Sherman sighed. "Exactly." Ahead, Colonel William Colville rode stiff-backed in the saddle, looking as tired as the men but far too stubborn to show it. His horse flicked its ears, unimpressed with the day's events. Major Mark Downey, their second-in-command, rode beside him. As the 1st Minnesota neared Cemetery Hill, Major Mark Downey spotted a disorganized stream of soldiers from the 11th Corps, men limping, their uniforms torn, some without rifles, all heading toward the rear. It was clear they had been through hell. Downey smirked and turned to Colonel William Colville. "Look, it's Howard's cowards." Colville, exhausted from the long march, couldn't help but chuckle. He knew the nickname well. A cruel label pinned on the 11th Corps after they had been routed at Chancellorsville. But after a moment, he shook his head. Well, it wasn't their fault Howard didn't put pickets out at Chancellorsville. Downey shrugged. "Maybe not, but they sure know how to run." Colville sighed, but said nothing. He had no patience for Army politics, but he knew one thing: no one in the 1st Minnesota would be running today. As the regiment reached Cemetery Hill, Wright got his first real look at what lay ahead. Smoke curled over the battlefield, drifting above shattered fences and fields trampled by thousands of boots. The town of Gettysburg sat just beyond the ridge, its rooftops barely visible through the haze. Union officers barked orders, their voices cutting through the din as they maneuvered men into position. Nearby, artillery crews scrambled to set up their guns along the ridge, ramming powder and shot down barrels with practiced urgency. Wright recognized Captain Alonzo Cushing and his battery, a familiar sight after countless marches spent stepping aside to let his cannons roll past. The young officer paced behind his guns, his sharp commands driving his men to work even faster. A courier galloped past, nearly running down a soldier who barely stepped aside in time. Sherman shook his head. "These couriers always in a hurry to tell us how bad things are." Wright smirked, "Probably trying to get out of here before the fighting starts." The regiment was ordered to halt, and the men gratefully dropped their gear. Some flopped onto the ground, stretching out their aching legs, while others reached for their canteens, trying to wash the dust from their throats. They ate quickly, hardtack and salt pork, the standard Army rations, both of which could have doubled as building materials. Wright watched as Private William Loughran stared at a piece of hardtack like it had personally wronged him. "Break a tooth on that, Loughran?" Wright asked. Loughran sighed. "Tried to. Hardtack won." The sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the ridge. Lightning bugs flickered in the air, their tiny lights dancing through the lingering smoke. The men settled in for the night, their exhaustion outweighing any nerves about tomorrow. Some used their cartridge boxes as pillows, the hard leather better than nothing. Others leaned against their packs or stretched out in the grass, their muskets resting within arm's reach. Sherman lay back with a sigh. "Might as well get comfortable." Wright stared up at the sky. Ain't nothing comfortable about what's coming next. The night deepened, the battlefield growing quiet except for the distant crackle of gunfire and the occasional cry of a wounded man in the dark. The 1st Minnesota slept, knowing full well that by this time tomorrow many of them wouldn't wake up again. The sun hung low over Gettysburg, turning the sky a hazy orange. Sergeant James Wright stood with the 1st Minnesota, shifting his weight from foot to foot, trying to shake the stiffness from his legs. They had spent most of the day in reserve, watching as the battle raged on the left flank. Somewhere beyond the smoke, men were dying by the hundreds in places that would become infamous: the wheat field, the peach orchard, Devil's Den. The cannon fire never stopped. Sweat dripped down Wright's neck. He glanced toward the ridge ahead, his stomach sinking as he took in the gap in the Union line. Nothing but scattered remnants of broken regiments stood between them and a fresh Confederate assault. If the rebels broke through here, the whole Union center could collapse. He swallowed hard. Every man in the regiment saw it too. No one spoke, but the looks passing between them said enough. They knew what was coming. They had seen men die by the hundreds at Bull Run, Antietam, and Fredericksburg. They had no illusions about what Hancock was about to ask of them. "You see that?" Wright muttered. Private Marshal Sherman wiped his face with his sleeve. "Not even close to enough men up there." Wright exhaled slowly. "Well, guess that means us." Then came the shouting. Men turned as Major General Winfield Scott Hancock thundered toward them on horseback. Hancock always looked like he belonged on a battlefield, broad-shouldered, dressed crisp despite the dust and heat. He saw it too, the hole in the line, the disaster waiting to happen. He barely slowed as he locked eyes with Colonel William Colville. "Advance, Colonel, and take those colors." Wright barely had time to process the order before Colville shouted it to the regiment. "Fix bayonets! Forward, at the double quick." 262 Minnesotans surged forward. By now there were no shirkers left, no cowards hiding in the ranks. The weak had fallen away in past battles, deserted, wounded, or buried in unmarked graves. Every man who charged knew what this meant. They were marching straight into hell, and most wouldn't come back. But if it meant holding the line, if it meant giving the army a fighting chance, then so be it. They would rather die than let their comrades down. Wright ran, musket clutched in both hands, his heart pounding as they charged straight into a brigade of over 1,200 Confederates. The Alabamians of General Cadmus Wilcox's brigade, their gray coats blurred by the smoke, stopped in their tracks as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Then the air filled with lead. Men fell. Wright heard someone grunt beside him. Loughran, shot through the shoulder but still running. A bullet tore through Wright's sleeve, missing his arm by a hair. He didn't stop. None of them did. The gap between the lines vanished. Wright slammed into a Confederate, swinging his musket like a club, knocking the man to the ground. He barely had time to reload before another rebel lunged toward him, eyes wild. A shot rang out from somewhere behind. Sherman had fired over Wright's shoulder, dropping the man before he could strike. "You're welcome," Sherman shouted. "Shoot someone else." Wright barked back. The fight dissolved into chaos. Bayonets flashed, rifles cracked, men screamed. Wright lost track of the world outside the battle. His only focus was reloading, firing, and not getting killed. Somewhere ahead, the color bearer of the 1st Minnesota went down, shot through the chest. The flag toppled, its crimson folds brushing the ground. Wright didn't think. He just lunged forward and grabbed it. A bullet ripped through the fabric just inches from his hand. Another slammed into the staff. Wright hoisted the banner high, holding on even as his arms ached. They would not let the flag fall. More Confederates poured in. The 1st Minnesota was outnumbered 4-1, and the cost of their charge was evident. Bodies lay in heaps. Colville was down, wounded. Lieutenant Colonel George Morgan had taken a bullet but still fought on. Then, through the smoke, Wright saw Union reinforcements arriving. Hancock's gamble had worked. Their suicidal charge had bought just enough time for fresh troops to plug the gap. The order to withdraw finally came. What was left of the 1st Minnesota staggered back, the shattered remnants of a regiment that had given everything. Wright, still clutching the flag, barely registered the retreat until Sherman grabbed his arm and dragged him along. Behind them, Confederates regrouped, stunned by the carnage the Minnesotans had inflicted but still standing. The battle wasn't over, but the 1st Minnesota's fight was. As they reached the ridge, General Hancock rode up, his face unreadable as he looked over the survivors. Then in a quiet voice he said, "No soldiers on any field, in this or any other country, ever displayed grander courage." The 1st Minnesota had started the fight with 262 men. By the time they regrouped, only 47 remained standing. Sergeant James Wright had never been this tired in his life. His lungs burned, his legs ached, and his hands trembled as he held the shredded flag of the 1st Minnesota. He barely remembered grabbing it in the chaos of their charge, but now it felt like it was stitched to his palm. Around him, the 47 survivors of the regiment staggered back to Cemetery Ridge, their faces blackened with smoke, their blue uniforms stained with blood, some of it their own, some not. Their charge had stalled 1,200 Alabamians, but at a cost so steep it barely seemed real. Marshal Sherman wiped a hand across his face. "Well, that went about as well as I expected." "We're still alive," Wright muttered, though he wasn't entirely sure how. That thought barely had time to settle before the cannons roared again. The battle was far from over. July 3, 1863, the cannons open up. At mid-afternoon, the air shook with the thunder of over 150 Confederate cannons. The barrage was so loud that it rattled teeth, bones, and whatever was left of men's sanity. Wright and the rest of the 1st Minnesota survivors were ordered to hold their ground near the angle, a section of the low stone wall that anchored the Union Center. The plan was simple: stay alive, shoot anything in gray that gets too close, and don't let the line break. As cannon fire screamed overhead, men ducked behind whatever cover they could find: rocks, fence posts, even the bodies of the fallen. A shell exploded nearby, showering Wright with dirt and debris. "That was close." "No, that was just the warm-up," Sherman grumbled. Then came the infantry, thousands of them. Pickett's charge had begun, the last fight. Through the smoke, Wright saw them coming, row upon row of Confederates marching straight toward the ridge. Their bayonets gleamed, their flags rippled in the wind, and their officers shouted orders over the cannon fire. It would have been impressive if it weren't so terrifying. Union artillery opened fire, tearing through the enemy ranks, but still they came. Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble's divisions, thousands of men, all bearing down on the thin blue line. The survivors of the 1st Minnesota raised their muskets and fired. The battle dissolved into smoke and chaos. Wright reloaded as fast as his shaking hands allowed, firing into the oncoming mass. Confederates stumbled, fell, and kept coming. The stone wall became a last stand, Union troops piling behind it as the rebels crashed into the line. Hand-to-hand combat erupted. Bayonets, rifle butts, fists. Wright fired point blank at a gray-coated officer climbing over the wall, then swung his musket at another. A Confederate rifle cracked, and a bullet ripped through his sleeve. It barely missed his arm, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through him. "Still alive?" Sherman shouted over the roar. Wright gritted his teeth. Barely. The Confederate wave faltered. They had come so close, but Union reinforcements surged forward, slamming into them with fresh volleys of musket fire. The gray lines buckled. Some tried to fight, some tried to run. Then the retreat began. Pickett's men fell back, stumbling, limping, dragging the wounded. The battle was over. Wright's hands shook as he finally lowered his musket. He blinked through the smoke in exhaustion, trying to process what had just happened. Sherman let out a long breath. "Well, I think we won." Wright looked around at what was left of the 1st Minnesota, a handful of men who had somehow survived 2 of the most suicidal fights in military history. He let out a dry chuckle. "And we barely had to die twice to do it." Sergeant James Wright stood on Cemetery Ridge, his musket resting in the crook of his arm, his body aching in ways he didn't think were possible. The sun had barely risen, and the battlefield smelled of gunpowder, smoke, and earth churned by thousands of boots and cannon blasts. Gettysburg was over, and somehow he was still alive. Around him, what remained of the 1st Minnesota lingered near the stone wall where they had fought during Pickett's charge. It wasn't much of a regiment anymore, just a handful of men with hollow eyes and uniforms torn to rags. Sherman sat on a rock, staring at his ruined boots. "You ever think about getting into farming after this?" Wright rubbed his aching shoulder. "Only if the cows shoot back. Otherwise, I won't know what to do with myself." In the morning, the 4th of July, rain fell on Gettysburg. A slow, steady drizzle, as if the sky itself was washing away the blood. News spread through the ranks. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was retreating. The Union had won. The cost? 50,000 men north and south, dead, wounded, or missing. Years later, the monument and the memory. The war ended, but the story of the 1st Minnesota never did. Some of the survivors went home, some re-enlisted, some carried their wounds for the rest of their lives, scars on the outside, and worse ones on the inside. Decades later, a monument was raised at Gettysburg, standing on the very ground where 262 Minnesotans had charged into history and into legend. Sherman, now old and gray, stood beside Wright at the dedication, looking up at the stone soldier atop the pedestal. Sherman squinted. "You think that statue's got better boots than we did?" Wright smirked. "No doubt, but I bet he never had to march in 'em." And with that, they turned and walked away, 2 of the last few still standing.